Mom, did you ever thank Olivia for managing the $680,000 from the house sale? My son Daniel asked with a casual smile, as if he were talking about something as ordinary as the weather, and in that moment I realized I had been living in a reality that didn't exist. For the past 2 years I had been stretching every dollar of my fixed income, cutting my blood pressure pills in half to make them last longer, keeping the thermostat at 62 degrees through the winter because I couldn't afford a higher heating bill, and telling myself that my son was just busy building his life, that his distance wasn't neglect but necessity, that his silence meant he was thriving, not forgetting me. I sat there at the edge of my worn kitchen table, the same one I'd had for over 30 years, staring at Daniel as if I'd misheard him, as if maybe age had finally caught up with me and I was losing pieces of reality one sentence at a time. But I hadn't misheard anything because Olivia, standing just behind him in her perfectly tailored coat and soft beige heels that probably cost more than my monthly rent, went very still, her smile tightening just slightly at the corners, the kind of expression you only notice when you've spent a lifetime reading people without them realizing it. "What house?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected, steady in a way that surprised even me because inside something cold and sharp was beginning to form. Daniel blinked, the confidence in his expression faltering for just a second before he laughed, a quick, dismissive sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The house, Mom. The one we sold for you. You said you didn't want to deal with the maintenance anymore, remember?" And I searched my memory, every conversation, every phone call, every visit over the past few years, but there was nothing, no agreement, no discussion, no signature, nothing except long stretches of silence and the occasional polite check-in that always ended too quickly. I looked down at my hands, at the thin veins beneath my skin, at the faint tremor that had become more noticeable in recent months, and I thought about the way I had skipped meals to make sure my medication would last until the next refill, about the nights I had sat in the dark to save on electricity, about the quiet pride I had forced myself to feel, telling myself that I was independent, that I didn't need to rely on anyone, not even my own son, and now he was sitting across from me talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars as if it were something I had simply forgotten. Olivia stepped forward then, her voice smooth and measured. "Margaret, maybe you just don't remember the details." It was a lot to process at the time, and there it was, subtle and clean, the suggestion placed gently between us like a napkin over a stain, the implication that the problem wasn't what had happened, but what I could no longer remember. I met her eyes, really looked at her for the first time that afternoon, and I saw something beneath the polish, beneath the careful tone and the practiced concern, something calculating, something that didn't belong in a family conversation. And in that moment, the confusion that had wrapped around me like fog began to thin, replaced by a quiet, deliberate clarity. If there had been a house, if there had been money, if there had been decisions made in my name without my knowledge, then this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was something else entirely, something planned, something hidden. And as Daniel continued talking, explaining numbers and timelines that meant nothing to me, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't just listening to my son, I was watching him, measuring every word, every glance toward his wife, every hesitation, and I understood that whatever had happened, whatever had been done, I was the only one at that table who hadn't been told the truth, and that realization settled over me not like panic but like resolve. I did not argue with them that afternoon because there was nothing to argue yet, only a hollow space where the truth should have been. And I have learned over the years that reacting too quickly only gives other people time to adjust their stories, so instead I nodded slowly, as if I were the one trying to remember something that had already happened, as if the confusion belonged to me and not to the situation unfolding in front of me, and I let Daniel continue explaining details that felt rehearsed, numbers that sounded clean and final, while Olivia stood beside him with that same controlled expression, occasionally placing a hand on his arm as if guiding him without anyone noticing, and I realized that whatever this was, it had not started today, it had been building quietly for a long time. After they left, I sat in my small apartment and looked around at everything I owned, the second-hand sofa I had bought 5 years ago, the chipped coffee mug I used every morning, the thin curtains that barely kept the afternoon sun out, and I tried to place this life next to the one they were describing, the one with a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the one with decisions made and money moved, and the two realities did not fit together no matter how I turned them, like puzzle pieces from different boxes forced into the same frame. That night I pulled out my old filing box from the closet, the one I had not opened in years because there had been no reason to, and I sat at the kitchen table under the dim overhead light, going through documents slowly, methodically, not because I expected to find answers there, but because I needed to remind myself of what I did know, what had actually happened, what I had actually signed, and what I had not. There were tax returns, utility bills, old insurance papers, all neatly organized in the way my husband used to insist on, but there was nothing about a house sale, no closing documents, no transfer records, nothing that even hinted at a transaction of that size. And as I moved each paper from one stack to another, I felt something settle deeper inside me, not panic, not anger, but a quiet certainty that this was not forgetfulness, this was absence, and absence does not create itself. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, and for the first time in a long while, I did not linger in bed trying to stretch the warmth a little longer. Instead I got dressed carefully, choosing one of my better coats even though the lining was worn, and I gathered every document I could find that had my name on it, placing them neatly into a folder, because if there had been a house, if there had been money, then there had to be a trail somewhere. And I intended to follow it. The bus ride to the bank took about 20 minutes, passing through neighborhoods that looked nothing like the one I had lived in when my husband was still alive, and I found myself watching the houses as we drove by, wondering which one had been mine, which one had been sold without me ever knowing it existed in that context. And the thought was not painful in the way I expected, it was distant, almost clinical, like observing someone else's life from the outside. Inside the bank, everything was quiet and orderly, the kind of place where nothing seems to go wrong, and I waited my turn, holding my folder tightly in my lap, feeling the weight of the papers inside as if they were the only solid thing left in a situation that was quickly becoming unclear. And when I finally sat down across from the young woman at the desk, I spoke calmly, choosing each word with care, because I did not want to sound confused. I did not want to give anyone the impression that I did not understand what I was asking. I need to review any property transactions connected to my name over the past 2 years. And as she began typing into her computer, her expression neutral at first, I watched closely, not just for what she would say, but for what she might not say, for the pauses, the small changes, the moments where something unexpected appears on a screen and has to be processed before it can be explained, and when her fingers slowed just slightly, when her eyes narrowed in that brief, almost imperceptible way. I knew I had just stepped onto the edge of something much larger than a misunderstanding, something that had been carefully arranged, quietly executed, and until now completely hidden from me. She did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because in a place where everything is supposed to be precise and documented, hesitation does not come from confusion, it comes from something that does not fit, and I sat there watching her screen reflect faintly in her glasses, waiting, not pressing, because I wanted her to show me exactly what she was seeing without interference, and when she finally looked back at me, her expression had shifted from routine politeness to something more careful, more measured. "Mrs. Collins, I am seeing a property transaction associated with your name," she said slowly, and I nodded as if that confirmed what I already knew, even though my chest had tightened slightly at the words. "Can you tell me the address?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, and she turned her screen slightly, pointing to a line of text that meant nothing to me at first glance. But as I read it again more carefully, I recognized the street name, not from recent memory but from years ago, from the house my husband and I had lived in before everything changed, before I downsized, before I convinced myself that letting go was a natural part of getting older, and for a moment I wondered if I had somehow signed something back then. Something I had forgotten, something that had only now been processed, but the dates did not match, the timeline did not make sense, and I felt that same quiet certainty return, stronger now, more defined. "When was this sold?" I asked, and she clicked a few more keys. "Approximately 18 months ago," she replied, and I let that number settle. 18 months of living as if nothing had changed, 18 months of budgeting groceries and medication while a property tied to my name had been converted into cash somewhere else, and I did not ask how much right away, because I already knew the number. Daniel had said it himself, and hearing it again would not change anything. What mattered was where it had gone. Where were the funds transferred? I asked, and this time the pause was longer, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice the way her posture adjusted, the way her fingers hovered above the keyboard before continuing, and when she answered, her tone was even more careful than before. The funds were transferred to an account that was updated prior to the transaction, and I felt something click into place, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, precise alignment of facts that had been scattered before. Updated. By whom? I asked, and she hesitated again, then turned her screen slightly back toward herself, as if confirming what she already knew. According to our records, the account information was changed through a phone request followed by documentation submitted electronically, she said, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed space to think clearly, to separate what was possible from what was not. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I had never made that call, I had never submitted any documentation, I had never authorized any change to any account tied to my name. The room felt quieter then, not empty but focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only the facts in front of me. And I asked the question that mattered most: "Can you show me the account the funds were sent to?" And she nodded, bringing up another set of details on her screen, numbers and names that meant everything and nothing at the same time. And when she read out the account holder's name, I did not react outwardly, I did not raise my voice or question her immediately, because the name was familiar, too familiar, and that familiarity was not comforting, it was confirming what had been forming quietly in my mind. Since yesterday, since the moment Olivia had suggested that I simply did not remember, because the account did not belong to me, it belonged to her. And as I sat there in that small office, with the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of other conversations behind me, I realized that this was no longer a question of misunderstanding or miscommunication. It was a matter of intention, of deliberate action taken in my name without my knowledge. And I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind of clarity that does not rush, does not demand immediate action, but instead builds piece by piece, until there is no room left for doubt. And as the bank employee continued explaining procedures and documentation, I listened carefully, not just to understand what had happened, but to understand what could be undone, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer trying to make sense of their story. I was beginning to see my own. The name lingered in my mind long after I left the bank, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had not wanted to say out loud, even to myself. And as I walked back toward the bus stop, holding my folder a little tighter against my chest, I began to replay every small moment from the past few years, every conversation that had seemed ordinary at the time, every visit that had felt slightly rushed, every decision that had been presented to me as something already settled. And for the first time, those moments did not feel disconnected, they aligned, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I thought about the last time Daniel had mentioned the house, how he had said it was becoming too much for me to manage, how Olivia had nodded in agreement, gently suggesting that simplifying my life would be better for my health, and I remembered how reasonable it had sounded, how I had trusted their concern without questioning the details, because that is what you do with family, you trust that their intentions are aligned with your well-being. But now looking back, I realized that the conversation had not been about helping me, it had been about preparing me, easing me into a narrative where I would not question what came next. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because of the clarity settling in, and I watched the city pass by through the window, the storefronts, the small houses, the people moving through their day without knowing how easily a life can be redirected without permission, and I wondered how many of them believed, as I had, that trust within a family was something solid, something that did not need to be examined too closely. When I reached my apartment, I did not sit down right away. Instead, I placed my folder carefully on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the silence of the room settle around me, because I needed to decide not what had happened, that part was already clear, but what I was going to do with it, and that decision required something more than emotion, it required precision. I opened the folder again, not to search for answers but to organize what I now knew, the date of the sale, the amount of the transaction, the account it had been transferred to, each detail placed in order, not because I needed to prove it to anyone else yet, but because I needed to see it clearly for myself without confusion, without doubt. And as I wrote those details down on a blank sheet of paper, I felt something shift inside me, something steady and deliberate, the kind of focus that comes when uncertainty is replaced by fact. I did not call Daniel that evening, and I did not confront Olivia because confrontation without preparation only creates noise, and I had no interest in noise. I was interested in understanding the full extent of what had been done, and more importantly, what had not been done correctly, because in situations like this, people who believe they are in control often overlook small details, and those details are where the truth reveals itself. Later that night, I pulled out another box from the back of my closet, one I had not opened since my husband passed, and inside were documents I had not needed in years, legal papers, old agreements, things he had insisted we keep even when I thought they were unnecessary, and as I flipped through them slowly, carefully, I began to see something I had almost forgotten, something he had once explained to me in a quiet, patient way about ownership, about protection, about making sure that no matter what happened, I would always have a measure of control over what was ours, and I remembered how I had listened without fully understanding at the time, trusting that he would always be there to handle those details, but now, sitting alone at my table, those details felt different, they felt relevant in a way they never had before. I traced my finger along the lines of a document, reading each word more carefully than I ever had, and I realized that whatever Daniel and Olivia believed they had done, whatever they thought they had secured, they may not have understood everything that was in place, because not all decisions can be made by assumption, and not all authority can be transferred by convenience, and as that thought settled in, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief but of recognition that this situation was not as one-sided as it appeared, and that for the first time since this began, I was not simply reacting to what had been done, I was beginning to prepare for what would come next. The document felt heavier in my hands than it should have, not because of its size, but because of what it represented, something my husband had put in place long before I ever thought I would need it, and as I read each line again, slower this time, I began to understand the structure he had quietly built around our life, a structure I had taken for granted because he had always been the one managing it, the one making sure everything was in order, and now, without him here to explain it again, I had to rely on what he had already written, on the intention behind every clause and condition, and one sentence in particular stood out to me, clear and unambiguous, stating that any transfer of property tied to my name required direct authorization that could not be substituted or reassigned without verified consent, and I sat back in my chair, letting that sink in, because if that condition had not been met, then whatever had been done was not just questionable, it was incomplete. The next morning I did not go back to the bank, instead I made a different call, one I had not expected to make but now felt necessary, and when the receptionist answered, I gave my name and asked if there was anyone still at the firm who had worked with my husband, and after a brief hold I was transferred to a voice that was older, steadier, someone who recognized my last name immediately. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a long time," he said, and there was a familiarity in his tone that I had not heard in years, not from Daniel, not from anyone, and for a moment I felt the distance between what had been and what was now, but I did not dwell on it. I explained why I was calling, carefully, without emotion, focusing only on the facts, the property sale, the account change, the absence of my authorization, and when I finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line, not uncertain but thoughtful, as if he were placing each piece exactly where it belonged. "Do you still have the original trust documents?" he asked, and I looked down at the paper spread out in front of me. "Yes," I replied, "I have them here." And he asked me to read a specific section aloud, guiding me to the part one had noticed the night before, and when I finished, he exhaled quietly. "That provision is still valid," he said, "and it is very specific. No transfer of that asset can be considered fully executed without your direct and verified approval." And I felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger now, anchored by confirmation, not just assumption. "What does that mean?" I asked, even though I already understood the direction of his answer. "It means," he said carefully, "that if what you are describing is accurate, then the transaction may have been processed, but it may not be legally complete in the way they believe it is." And there it was, not dramatic, not loud, but precise, the kind of statement that changes everything without raising its voice, and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of relief but to steady my thoughts, because this was no longer about what had been taken, it was about what could still be reclaimed. He asked me to come into the office later that week, to bring every document I had, every statement, every record, and I agreed, writing down the appointment time carefully, because I understood now that this was not something to rush. It required accuracy, patience, and control, the same qualities my husband had always emphasized, and as I hung up the phone, I looked around my apartment again at the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet space that had felt small and limiting just days ago, and I realized that nothing about it had changed. Only my understanding had, and that understanding shifted the balance in a way Daniel and Olivia could not yet see. I spent the rest of the day organizing everything, not just the documents from the bank, but my own records, my notes, the timeline as I now understood it, placing each piece in order so that nothing could be dismissed as confusion or misinterpretation. Because I knew that when the time came, clarity would matter more than emotion, and as I worked, I thought about Daniel, about the way he had smiled when he mentioned the money, about the ease in his voice, and I wondered how much he truly knew, how much had been explained to him, how much he had chosen not to question, but I did not allow myself to dwell on that for long, because whether he had been misled or complicit did not change what had happened, and it did not change what I needed to do. Next, by the time evening came, everything was in place, the documents aligned, the timeline clear, the next steps defined, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up to something that had already happened. I felt like I was standing exactly where I needed to be, at the beginning of something new, something that would not be decided by assumption or silence but by fact and by choice. The law office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet, polished, and filled with a kind of order that made everything feel deliberate, as if nothing inside those walls happened by accident, and as I sat across from Mr. Reynolds, the same man who had once walked my husband through every decision with careful precision, I felt the weight of the past and the present meet in a way that was both unsettling and grounding, because this was not new territory for him, even if it was for me. He reviewed each document I had brought, not quickly, not casually, but with the kind of attention that comes from years of knowing where mistakes tend to hide, and as he turned each page, occasionally making a small note or adjusting the stack in front of him, I watched without interrupting, understanding that silence in this room was not emptiness, it was process, and when he finally leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, his expression was calm but unmistakably focused. "You were correct to come in," he said, and those words, simple as they were, carried more reassurance than anything else I had heard so far, because they confirmed that I was no longer navigating this alone. He explained that while the transaction had been processed through the bank, the underlying legal structure attached to the property had not been properly satisfied, that the trust my husband had established was not something that could be bypassed simply by updating account information or submitting documentation without verified consent, and as he spoke, I followed each point carefully, not just listening but understanding, because this was no longer abstract, it was specific, it was actionable. In simple terms, he continued, they moved the money, but they did not secure the right to do so in a way that will hold up under scrutiny, and I nodded slowly, not because I was surprised but because I needed to absorb the implication of that statement, that what had been presented to me as a completed action was, in fact, incomplete in a way that could not be ignored. He outlined the next steps with the same clarity, beginning with a formal notice to the bank to flag the transaction for review, followed by a legal request to temporarily restrict access to the funds until proper authorization could be verified, and I asked him if that meant the account could be frozen, and he paused for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. It means that any further movement of those funds can be halted while the situation is examined, and that distinction mattered because this was not about retaliation, it was about control, about restoring a balance that had been quietly shifted without my knowledge. As we discussed the details, I realized how much had been assumed on the other side, how much Daniel and Olivia must have believed that once the money had been transferred, the matter was settled, final, irreversible, and that assumption, more than anything else, was where their confidence had come from. But assumptions do not hold weight in a structure built on documentation and verification, and I could see that clearly now. Before I left, Mr. Reynolds handed me a copy of the relevant sections of the trust, marked and annotated in a way that made them easier to reference, and he told me to keep my interactions with Daniel and Olivia minimal for the time being. Not out of fear, but out of strategy, because once they became aware that the transaction was being questioned, their behavior would change, and it was important to let the process move forward without interference. I stepped out of the office into the late afternoon light, holding the papers carefully, and for the first time since this began, the uncertainty that had surrounded me was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on what they said or what they believed, but on what could be demonstrated, what could be verified. And as I made my way back toward the bus stop, I thought about the difference between what appears to be control and what actually is, and how easily the two can be confused when everything seems to be going according to plan, and I knew then that whatever plan Daniel and Olivia thought they had executed, it was built on something incomplete, something they had not fully understood, and that gap, that small but critical gap, was where everything was about to change. The notice was sent 2 days later, quiet and formal, nothing dramatic, just a series of documents delivered through the proper channels. And I did not expect an immediate reaction because I understood now that processes like this move beneath the surface before they ever appear on it. But I also knew that once the right people saw those documents, once the right systems flagged the transaction, something would shift. Not visibly at first, but enough to disrupt whatever sense of control had been built on the assumption that everything was finished. I continued my routine as usual, waking early, making my coffee the same way I always had, measuring it carefully so it would last the full week, sitting by the window with the same quiet view of the street below. But there was a difference now, not in what I did, but in how I observed it, because I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I was allowing something already in motion to unfold. 3 days passed without a word from Daniel, which was not unusual in itself, but on the 4th day my phone rang just after noon, his name appearing on the screen in a way that felt almost predictable, and when I answered, his voice was different, not the easy confidence I had heard before, but something tighter, controlled in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Mom, have you been to the bank recently?" he asked, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking out the window as I responded, "Yes, I have," keeping my tone neutral, not offering more than he had asked for. There was a pause on the line longer than usual, and I could almost hear him adjusting his thoughts. "They told us there is some kind of review happening, something about authorization," he continued, and I did not interrupt. I let him finish because I wanted to hear exactly how he understood the situation. "Olivia says it is probably just a clerical issue, but it is holding things up," he added, and there it was, the first crack, small but clear, not in the transaction itself but in their certainty about it. "What exactly is being held up?" I asked, not because I did not know, but because I wanted him to say it, to define it in his own words, and there was another pause, shorter this time. "The account access," he replied, and I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me, because that was exactly where the process would begin to take effect, not by reversing what had been done immediately, but by limiting what could be done next. I kept my voice calm as I spoke again. "That sounds like something they should look into carefully." And I could feel his hesitation through the silence that followed, as if he were trying to decide whether to press further or accept the response as it was, and after a moment, he shifted his tone slightly, softer now. "Did you sign anything recently, Mom? Anything about the house?" And I let that question sit between us for a second before answering, "No, Daniel, I did not." And this time the silence was different, heavier, because there was no ambiguity in my response, no room for interpretation. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty. "That is strange," he said, almost to himself, and I did not offer to explain, because explanation was not my role at this moment. Understanding was his. After we ended the call, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a while, not thinking about what I had said, but about what I had not said, because silence, when used correctly, reveals more than explanation ever could. And I knew that from this point forward, every conversation, every reaction, every decision they made would be influenced by the realization that something was no longer under their control. Later that evening, I received a brief email from Mr. Reynolds confirming that the initial review had been acknowledged and that further steps were already being prepared, the language precise, the tone measured, and I read it twice, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to feel the steadiness behind it, the assurance that this was moving forward exactly as it should. I did not feel satisfaction, not yet, because this was not about winning or losing, it was about correction, about restoring something that had been quietly altered. And as I turned off the light and prepared for the night, I realized that whatever Daniel and Olivia were beginning to sense, whatever uncertainty was starting to replace their confidence, was only the beginning, because the structure they had overlooked was not reacting to them, it was simply asserting itself. And once that process was fully in motion, there would be no way to return to the version of events they had believed was already complete. The shift became visible the following week, not in a dramatic way, but in the small, controlled disruptions that only matter if you understand what they mean, and I recognized them immediately because I was now paying attention in a way I had not before, watching not just what was said but what changed. Daniel called again, this time earlier in the morning, his voice carrying a quiet urgency that he was trying to keep contained. "Mom, we might need to stop by later today," he said, not asking, not quite telling, but placing the idea between us as if it were already decided, and I paused for a moment before responding, not to create tension, but to let him feel the weight of the moment. "That depends on why," I said calmly, and there was a brief silence, as if he had not expected resistance, even a small one. "We just need to talk about the account situation," he replied, and I could hear Olivia in the background, not speaking directly, but present, close enough to be guiding the conversation without being heard clearly, and I understood then that whatever had been happening behind the scenes had reached a point where they could no longer ignore it. You are welcome to come by, I said after a moment, but I do not think this is something that can be resolved in my kitchen. And that was the first time I set a boundary, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly enough that it could not be mistaken, and I heard the hesitation on the other end before Daniel responded. What do you mean? And I let my answer remain simple. I mean that if there are questions about authorization, then those questions should be handled where they belong, and I did not need to say more than that because he already understood even if he did not want to admit it yet. They arrived that afternoon not together. In the easy coordinated way they usually did, but slightly out of step, Daniel entering first, Olivia following a moment later, her expression composed but tighter than I had ever seen it, and as they sat across from me, I noticed the difference immediately. The confidence that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more calculated, as if they were trying to regain control of a situation that had quietly slipped out of their hands. Mom, the bank says there is a legal review on the funds, Daniel began, choosing his words carefully, and I nodded, not interrupting, allowing him to continue. They are saying there is an issue with the authorization and it is preventing access, he added, and I could see the frustration beneath his restraint, not directed at me yet, but building, searching for somewhere to land, and Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. Margaret, this is likely just a misunderstanding. These things happen when records are updated, especially when someone else helps manage the process. And there it was again, the same subtle suggestion, the same attempt to frame the situation as confusion rather than intention, but this time it did not land the same way because I was no longer uncertain. Then it should be simple to clarify, I said, meeting her gaze directly, and for a brief moment something flickered in her expression, not fear, not yet, but recognition that the conversation was not unfolding the way she expected. Daniel shifted in his seat, looking between us. Did you contact someone about this? He asked, and I answered without hesitation. Yes, I did. And I watched as that answer settled over him, changing the direction of his thoughts, forcing him to reconsider what he believed he understood. And for the first time I saw doubt, not just in the situation, but in the version of events he had accepted without question. Why would you do that? He asked, and the question was not confrontational, it was confused, as if he could not yet reconcile the idea that I had taken action independently, and I considered my answer carefully, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted it to be clear, precise, and impossible to dismiss, because something was done in my name without my consent, I said, and the room went quiet, not the comfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that forces everything unspoken to surface, and I did not fill it, I let it remain because silence now was no longer a space of uncertainty, it was a space of truth. And as they sat there processing what I had said, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption or control, but by the reality they could no longer avoid. Daniel was the first to break the silence, but the words did not come out the way he intended. I could see that before he even finished his sentence. Mom, you are making this sound worse than it is, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried before, and I did not respond immediately because this was not a moment for quick answers. It was a moment for clarity, and clarity requires space, so I simply looked at him, letting him continue if he chose to, and after a brief pause, he added, we were trying to help you, the house was too much, you said that yourself, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the part that was true without allowing it to define the whole, because truth, when used carefully, can be shaped into something misleading, and I had seen that happen already. Olivia leaned forward again, her tone measured, controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath it. Margaret, there is no reason to involve lawyers in something that can be resolved as a family, she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, appealing to something she assumed I still prioritized above all else, but I had already moved beyond that point, not emotionally but logically, because this was no longer about preserving comfort, it was about addressing fact. It stopped being a family matter when decisions were made without me. I replied, my voice even, not raised, not strained, just steady, and I watched as that statement settled between us, removing the space for interpretation that had existed before. Daniel shifted again, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen since he was a boy when he felt cornered by something he did not fully understand. Olivia handled most of the details, he said, and there it was, not an accusation, not yet, but a separation, a small distance placed between his understanding and her actions, and Olivia turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to register the shift, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before she composed herself again. Because someone had to, she said calmly, but the calmness now felt constructed rather than natural. You were overwhelmed, Margaret, and Daniel trusted me to manage things efficiently, she continued, and I noticed how she did not say with your approval, only with his trust. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. In that sentence, I reached for the folder on the table beside me and placed it gently in front of us, not opening it yet, just letting it exist there, visible, present, something that represented more than memory or opinion, and I saw both of their eyes shift toward it, not out of curiosity but out of recognition, because documents change conversations in a way that words alone cannot. The bank did not flag this as a clerical issue, I said, still not raising my voice. They flagged it because the authorization required for that transfer was never properly completed, and this time neither of them spoke right away, because this was not something that could be redirected with explanation. It was specific, it was defined, and it left little room for interpretation. Daniel looked at Olivia, searching, not accusing but questioning, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty fully take hold, not just about the situation, but about the person he had relied on to handle it, and Olivia held his gaze for a moment before looking back at me. That is not accurate, she said, but her tone had shifted again, less certain now, more defensive. All the documents were submitted, she added, and I nodded once more because I had expected that response. Submitted is not the same as authorized, I said, and the difference between those two words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full of everything that had been assumed, everything that had been overlooked, everything that was now being forced into view, and I could see it in Daniel's expression, the slow realization that something had not been explained to him the way he believed it had, that the version of events he had accepted was incomplete, and that incompleteness was now unraveling in front of him. I did not press further, I did not raise my voice or demand answers, because the moment did not require it. The truth was already present, already doing its work, and as I sat there, watching them process what could no longer be dismissed, I understood that this was the turning point, not because I had won anything, but because the structure they had relied on had been exposed as unstable, and once that instability is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and whatever came next would no longer be shaped by what they intended but by what they had failed to secure.